Quinault, Canoe Family, Paddle Song, and we have Robert A. Williams Jr. on the line, and thanks for calling us this evening. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you, Raven, for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. I'm real excited to talk to you and share, and I love I'm reading one of your books. Actually got it here with me, and I'm real excited. It's The Linking Arms Together, and I know that you have another book out, Savage Anxieties, and I'm hoping to get that soon to read. I'm real intrigued with some of the. I've listened to a lot of the interviews that you've done, and I'm real intrigued to hear some of the the information that I think that all people need, especially our Native people. So I'll give you a first chance just to kind of introduce yourself, and I do have a few questions, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, Rob Williams. I teach here at the University of Arizona in Tucson. I teach at the Law College. I'm also faculty co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy program. I mention that because my other co-chair is Professor James Anaya, who just finished his 6-year term as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples. I've got a number of books out. My latest book is Savage Anxieties, and then some of the other books I've done, American Indian Western Legal Thought. The Linking Arms book is probably my favorite. I'm glad you like that. And then Like a Loaded Weapon, the Rehnquist Court, Indian Rights, and the Legal History of Racism Against American Indians. And I also am a co-author on a leading federal Indian law casebook with some other editors that's used in law schools across the country. So I've done a lot of writing. Also done a lot of representation. Our program, the IPLT program here at the University of Arizona, has a very active clinic program. We've represented Indigenous peoples not only in the U.S. Supreme Court and federal courts here in the United States, but we've appeared representing Indigenous peoples before the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in the Inter-American Human Rights System, and also in domestic courts all around the world. So we bring students, particularly Native students from all over the world and all over the country and all over Canada, to our program here in Arizona. And they get to take courses as well as work on real cases representing Indigenous clients. So it's a great program. We've been here for quite a while, building it up. And so, I encourage any of your listeners out there interested in going to law school and doing Indigenous rights to look us up.
All right. And I wanted to first talk about federal Indian law, and I told you I was talking to you and let you know that I am in school right now learning, and I've always read a lot about Indian law, federal Indian law, but I'm getting a deeper understanding of it, and I wanted to talk about why it's so important for Native people, and especially to learn about federal Indian law and the overall Western society. Yeah,
well, for Native people here in the United States, their daily existence, their daily life, their rights as tribal members, their rights to access to their traditional lands and resources, their rights to their culture, to speak their language, have all been affected and have been directed by these principles of federal Indian law. So the importance of understanding federal Indian law for Native people, it's more than just their lawyers. Tribal leaders need to know about it, community organizers, grassroots people, and anybody living out on the reservation, or might be an urban Indian who has contacts back on the reservation. This sort of giant apparatus we call federal Indian law is going to affect your daily life if you're a Native person. It's also important for non-Native people to understand and to learn about. There was a very famous non-Native Indian law scholar named Felix Kohn back in the 1940s, and he came up with a very famous metaphor. He said the way that the United States treats Indians under its law is very much like the miner's canary. And the miner's canary was the bird that the miners would bring down into the mines. And as long as it was singing, you knew you had fresh air. But once that bird stopped singing, then you knew it was poison gas, and you had better get out of that mine. And so what Kohn was trying to teach all Americans was that the way that we respect Indian rights and respect the treaties says a lot about our own democratic faith. So not only is it critically important for Native people, but it's for non-Native people as well. Really need to understand the history and the contemporary treatment of indigenous peoples under U.S. law.
I absolutely agree, and I feel like the law and the especially that protects the ceremonies for Native people, until if Native people can't practice their ways, I feel we're all done.
Yeah. We're in fact our program, the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program, just filed a request with the Inter-American Human Rights Commission for a thematic hearing on that very issue. We represent the Navajo Nation on a case here in Arizona involving one of the Navajo's 4 sacred peaks, the San Francisco Mountains, and the Forest Service has allowed a ski resort to use reclaimed water, recycled wastewater on that mountain. And it's got the Navajos very upset. They brought a case before the Ninth Circuit. They lost there because of a lack of rights under U.S. law. And they're now going to the international arena and have asked us to represent them. And we've requested the Inter-American Commission to hold a special hearing on that issue. That's how important that issue is. We've got the San Carlos Apache involved. They've recently found themselves having their sacred lands sold off to a copper company, Rio Tinto, area that they had used for gathering and for ceremonies. And this area, very sacred area called the Apache Leap, will be affected. It's where a number of Apaches in the 1800s confronted U.S. cavalry and were literally forced off the cliff and died. And this area is going to be sacrificed now for a copper mine. So these are issues, I think you've really hit the nail on the head. I can't think of any more important issues than protection of sacred sites and sacred lands and lands where ceremonies and gathering takes place, because that really is how Native people perpetuate their culture.
Yeah, and I think you talked about it a little bit in one of the interviews about how important it is for Native people to have access to these sites, and and that makes me think of you call it the S word, and the not saying it, the sovereignty word, it's not really accurate. And I think that having access to these sites is a part of self-determination, and it helps Native people move forward.
Yeah, this whole discussion of sovereignty is interesting. I've been teaching federal Indian law and indigenous peoples' human rights now for more than 30 years, and I always hear the word sovereignty. Well, I also teach property law. And anybody who knows anything about property law knows that sovereignty goes back, it's an English feudal concept, goes back to the 12th and 13th century. It was tied to the divine right of kings. It means that the king has all power over the land, and it's a completely countercultural concept. I've spoken all over the world to Native groups, whether it's in Australia or New Zealand or throughout North America. And I've always asked the same question. I said, what is your word in your own native language for sovereignty? And there is no such word. You can come up with different native words that sort of make up the idea, but it's a countercultural concept. And I always make the point to my audiences that Native American people and Native peoples do not have a right to sovereignty under international law, but they do have a right to self-determination. And that is the foundational human right. And what that means is that their aspirations to govern themselves and to structure their relationships with their settler states, the peoples who colonize them, that's a right that may have been taken away, but it still exists under international law. Whereas sovereignty is one of those things that's involved with, what Europeans used to do. Sovereigns would draw boundaries and draw borders. I mean, that's why Europeans made treaties. When I always make the point in my classes, Europeans made treaties to draw lines, to separate Catholics from Protestants and Germans from Spaniards and Islam from Christianity. Whereas in the book you're reading, Linking Arms Together, I went and I read over 500 Native treaty negotiations that were recorded. And what you find is consistently that Native peoples make treaties to make connections, to link arms together, to eat out of the same bowl, to develop kinship relationships. And so it's two different conceptions of treaties. One comes from this European idea of sovereigns who draw lines and boundaries and exclude. And the other comes from this human rights idea, which you find embodied in all Native political and legal philosophies of self-determination. It's the old two-row wampum. We travel down the two rivers together, each in our boats, our canoe and the man of war, the English man of war, but neither tries to steer the other boat. And so, these are things that happen when you start having the conqueror's language, the colonizer's language, define the rights of the colonized. And I think one of the biggest challenges that Native leaders, Native youth, Native organizers, community organizers need to confront in the 21st century is how do we break out of this language box? How do we go back to our own Native knowledge as a source of strength, as a source of culture, as a source of tradition, as a source of right, and begin to put that language out there to counter the dominant narrative that the colonizers' society seeks to impose upon Indigenous people.
Well, and so the self-determination becomes the framework that we need to build on, which leads me to the concept that I was talking to you. There's no such idea as boundaries with Native people. They traveled everywhere to build, I guess, a covenant is what we've been talking about lately.
Yep.
Amongst each other. So can we talk a little bit about that concept of boundaries and how here it didn't come from Native people?
No, it didn't. In fact, what you find is that long before Europeans came to the New World, Indigenous peoples had a very complicated understanding of international relations. And again, it wasn't an understanding as in Europe where you divided people, where you drew lines, where you said this person's going to be a Catholic and that person's going to be a Protestant. For Native people, international law and international relations was a way to extend their sacred relationships, for example, the Iroquois under the Great Tree of Peace. And you don't really find any conception of boundaries. I mean, the Navajo will know that their traditional lands are within the 4 sacred mountains. But within that area, we know historically the Zuni would come within those areas and perform ceremonies. The Navajo would permit the Hopi to come. Up in your area, I've done a lot of work on Vancouver Island with some of the Coast Salish tribes up there, the Hul'qumi'num. And they, for example, have a tradition that they still remember that when a Hul'qumi'num canoe or longboat was going by an area controlled and recognized as owned by another tribe, they would give a signal. They might sing a song or they might whistle, and then they would acknowledge the owners, the true owners, the traditional owners of that land, and seek permission. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. This concept of boundaries, the reservation line being nailed down, those, again, are Western European concepts that have really no connection to Indigenous reality. It's very much, I don't want to bring up another topic in connection with that, but now that I think about it, it's very much like this concept of blood quantum and who's a member of the tribe. Again, traditionally, if you look back prior to contact, there's no history of blood quantum. Indigenous peoples had their own laws and customs for membership and community reputation, kinship, adoption. It was much more flexible than the type of rigid categories that you see in the West that are imposed. So this concept of whether it's boundaries or whether it's blood quantum or whether it's membership requirements, again, these are all alien concepts that have been imposed by the colonizer. And the challenge is not to internalize those, but to reject those and to return to our own native knowledge.
Right, and it leads me to, I heard you say this, and I really agree with it, that Indian people are not lawless people.
Absolutely not. I mean, a lot of my work, and for example, the book Savage Anxieties, and the book that you're looking at, Linking Arms Together, what I try and do is show that this sort of dominant Western paradigm, this Western mindset that Indians are savages, that they're backwards, that they're uncivilized, that when Europeans came to this continent, they were living in the Stone Age, that they had no laws, that they had no understanding of property, that they had no international law. This was all part of the great racial myth to justify conquest and colonization and dispossession. But what we find is anybody who goes onto the reservation today, anybody who knows anything about the customs and traditions of their own tribe will know that Indian people are a people of law. It's interesting, though, in many native languages, the word for law and the word for justice are the same, whereas, again, in the Western languages, the two concepts are divided. Indigenous peoples have their own unique cultural conceptions of law, and it tends to be much more tightly connected to notions of justice. And it's a much more holistic approach to the way that we use justice to balance human relationships. Justice is typically, and law are typically matters of balance. Restoring balance, restoring the arrows, for example, as some of the Plains tribes talk about. The Navajos have this concept of hojo, which means harmony, and that the whole concept of Navajo law is focused on restoring harmony. So, again, one of the things that we really work on with the students who come to our program We really focus on three areas of knowledge that we think that not only tribal lawyers but tribal leaders. The first area of knowledge is that knowledge of federal Indian law, because again, as we spoke, it's so important in the everyday lives of Indigenous people. The second area of knowledge is international human rights law, because that's a much more firm basis of appeal for Indigenous rights than any of the rights that are provided under U.S. domestic law. And then that third area of knowledge, which I happen to think is the most important, is the native knowledge. It's how do we draw on our own customs and traditions to reconstruct, to rehabilitate, to restore what was taken away, what we've been dispossessed of, and rebuilding our own notions of law and justice, whether it's circle sentencing in Canada, for example, a number of the tribes are attempting, or moving back toward traditional notions of property use and ownership in many reservations. Those are the types of challenges that Indigenous people confront today.
Yeah, and I think that when I think about it, and I've been reading a lot about tribal courts and how, not just tribal courts, but the U.S. courts, how they've taken everything, but they're more punishment, punitive, and they don't want that healing that you're talking about. It seems that that element is not in our courts today, the U.S. courts. Yeah,
there were no jails before Westerners came to the New World, right? That again, this idea of jail, of imprisonment, of incarceration, of punishment instead of restoring, restoration, and what we call therapeutic jurisprudence. How do you heal? I actually, and this is interesting, I think, particularly for some of your readers who might, or listeners who might be familiar with the tragic situation that happened at Tulalip and some of the shootings. I've actually had a student who's done his PhD dissertation on the difference between community reaction in Native communities versus non-Native communities when you have these horrible situations of mass shootings. And there is a difference. Oftentimes in the non-Native community, unfortunately, the family of the person who perpetrated the violence is oftentimes blamed, they're oftentimes sued, they're oftentimes forced to move from the community. One of the situations in Connecticut, the home that the perpetrator had lived in, and in which he had killed his mother, was taken over by the town. They were talking about destroying it. Yet the research shows that in the several instances where you've had these horrible situations in Native communities, the response has been much different. It's been focusing on restoration, trying to focus on healing, not so much of vindictiveness and revenge or suit, but it is a different response. And I do think that indicates a much different type of set of cultural values at work when Native peoples control their own law and order systems. It is that focus on restoring harmony, of trying to find ways to bring that person back into the community in a way that they're not a danger to others or to themselves. And that's a real challenge because, as we started off this conversation, so much of Western justice is focused on imprisonment and punishment, and we really don't even worry about rehabilitation. And what that does is leave a real gap for both victims as well as for the families of those people who've been convicted of crimes, and sometimes the perpetrators themselves, unless you can find a way to reintegrate all those folks back into the community itself, and so that both the victims as well as the perpetrators know that justice has been done, but that there's also a basis to move forward. That healing doesn't take place.
Right, and they're all involved in that healing.
That is the real difference. In Native communities, everyone recognizes that responsibility to be involved in that healing, whereas in Western societies, oftentimes we push it off on the police and prosecutors and professional counselors. Western societies have entire professions built up around the criminal justice system. We even have private corporations that now build our jails and run the jails for us. And oftentimes, Indians are, particularly in federal prisons, are a large percentage of that population. We have an incarceration industry in this country. And again, that's a very non-Native approach to these types of issues.
Yeah, and it comes into play with, when I was talking a little bit about the definition of how people see Native people. And it's very harmful. Like you said, Native people have real 20th century problems, and they're dealing with them on the same issues as America. But the way that they react is differently.
Well, that's right, and the way that non-natives react too. Again, we know we have a horrible problem of domestic violence on in Indian reservations, and we know that's directly caused by federal Indian law and Supreme Court decisions, one of which was right up in your neck of the woods at the Suquamish Indian tribe, a very famous 1978 case called Oliphant v. Suquamish, in which Justice Rehnquist and the Supreme Court held that Indian tribes cannot prosecute non-Indian criminals for crimes committed on the reservation. So this does contribute to the law and order problems on the reservation. And if you ask, as I show in my book, many of my books focus on this. Why is it that the Supreme Court feels that Indian tribes don't have the same rights to have safe communities, to impose law and order, to prosecute those who commit crimes as other communities? And it goes back to this idea, well, Indians are uncivilized, they're lawless, they're savage, non-Indians won't get a fair trial. And so it's really those stereotypical reactions that go all the way back to the early colonial days, in which non-Indians assumed that Indians were lawless, uncivilized, uneducated, less sophisticated people who didn't have the same rights as non-Indians. So that's the mentality that really needs to be changed.
Right, and you talked about in a few interviews with the Western myth with the savage tribal peoples in Homer's Odyssey, and you talked about tribalism has been at the Western civilization has been at war with tribalism for 3,000 years, and you talked about Homer's Odyssey. I want to talk a little bit about that because that falls into the American Holocaust that a lot of people don't really want to talk about, and then the Doctrine of Discovery.
And I write about that in my latest book, Savage Anxieties, because I wrote that book to figure out where does this myth begin, this myth that tribal peoples are inherently less sophisticated and have less rights than Western European Christian society. And I kept going back and back. And what I did, I stopped really at the very beginnings of Western civilization with the ancient Greeks. And, of course, Homer, as you mentioned, the first books ever reduced to writing in the West are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And, I'm sure just about everybody in your audience, if they haven't read parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey, have seen movies or heard other stories based on the Iliad and the Odyssey. They really are. My English teacher used to say that after Homer, everything was plagiarism. These are stories that everybody knows, and if you read them, they're all about the great Greek warrior heroes from this, quote, sophisticated civilized society going around the world and colonizing different countries and encountering savage, fierce races of peoples, half monsters, whether it's the Lestrygonians, the giant rock-throwing Lestrygonians, or the one-eyed Cyclops. They're always described as tribal peoples. And so I make the point in that book, Savage Anxieties. You can trace this war against tribalism that the West has had from the Romans. I mean, think about who the Romans defeated. They defeated the tribal peoples of Central Europe, the Gauls, the Celts, the tribes of the Danube, for example, Caesar's Gallic Wars. They're all about the Roman Empire's conquest and colonization of tribal areas. And this war against tribalism that I trace back 3,000 years that the West has been engaged in, you can trace it through Charlemagne's wars in the Middle Ages against the tribal peoples of Germany, for example, and the forced Christianization and conversion of those people. You can trace it going into the Crusades and the conquest of England and Ireland by the Normans, and it continues all the way into Columbus and the Spaniards. And I think it's important for indigenous peoples to understand this 3,000-year war that has been bred out of incredible racism and a sense of cultural superiority. I make the point that it's part of the West DNA, that the West has been at war with tribal savagery, as they call it, since its very beginnings. And unless we encounter that and confront it and understand it, we're not going to have very much success fighting for Indian rights.
Right, and I remember reading it when I was in high school, but I went back to it after I started to read it, and I went, oh my God, he's absolutely right. Almost every word is, tribal savage or, savagery or, gotta defeat, and
conquer and colonize and expand. And that's, your experience is the same experience that my students have is, you read these things and subconsciously you're taking all this in, all this conflict, all these stereotypes, but nobody's sort of drumming it into your head. We absorb these images, whether it's watching Hollywood westerns or whether it's turning on the TV and seeing some fashion model wearing a headdress or something like that, or whether it's watching a movie like Avatar and the tribal peoples there. In the West, we absorb what I call it's a language of savagery, and that language holds that indigenous tribal peoples are inferior to Western non-indigenous societies. And we're all familiar. I always, your audience, go ask a 6-year-old to speak Indian. Ask your younger brother or your child to speak Indian. What they're going to say, ugh and how, right? Ask them about the Lone Ranger, and they'll all know about Tonto. We have these stereotypes that are just part of our everyday existence, whether we learn them in school or through the radio or through the media. And you're right, nobody ever stops and says, well, gee, take a look at that. Why are we using that? It's just a constant barrage, and that's how these attitudes are formed.
And then you can see from it where the Doctrine of Discovery picked up and how that's being used today.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Doctrine of Discovery, it's a legal doctrine, but it goes all the way back to the discovery of America. And actually goes back much farther. It's wherever Christians went, wherever they discovered tribal peoples who didn't believe in Christianity, then they had the right to claim superior sovereignty over the land and lives of those people. And so when Columbus sails to the New World and he gets out of his boat in the Caribbean and he sees people that he describes as savage and backwards and walking around naked who have no understanding of money or property, and he has the King and Queen of Spain ask permission from the papacy to conquer and colonize and convert them. And that's under the Doctrine of Discovery. That doctrine was accepted by England when the Cabots sailed down the coast of North America and claimed that for the English crown. It was asserted by the Russians in Alaska. It was the Western legal doctrine used to define indigenous people's rights, and it's still used today. That's the point I make in all my books, and it's what I teach, and it's what I try to advocate, is that this Doctrine of Discovery is still the major central legal principle of federal Indian law. It's cited by the most liberal Supreme Court judges as well as by the most conservative. Justice Ginsburg, the most liberal member of the court, cites the Doctrine of Discovery in footnote 1 of her case decided about 10 years ago. I believe it was 2005, Sherrill versus Oneida. Very important land rights case, and she begins with the Doctrine of Discovery. So if Western legal analysis begins with this racist doctrine, which holds that indigenous peoples have lesser rights than Westerners because of their inferior culture, if it begins with that very foundational principle, then you can understand why it's so hard to defend and assert Native rights in this country and other Western countries that accept the doctrine.
Right, and we went from these figures of... it makes me upset, but 144 million with treaties to 90 million, and when the General Allotment happened, and it based on this Doctrine of Discovery, and it keeps building on that, and basically took away 90 million native ownership of their own homelands.
That's an important point, and again, it's part of this language of savagery and this mythology which says, well, Indians didn't know what they were doing when they were signing treaties, right? That they didn't really appreciate property. Not true. And again, that myth contributes to this sort of myth of Indian people without laws. If you look at the first series of treaties signed before the Civil War, Indian tribes secured over 144 million acres of land. And then what happens is after the Civil War, the United States develops the railroad. You have the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which the U.S. acquires California and Arizona and New Mexico from Mexico. You connect both the West Coast and the East Coast, and you have this huge infusion of European immigrants coming over, and they need land. And so Congress says, you know what? We gave the Indians way too much land in those early treaties. And those treaties had placed Indians on reservations. They had the BIA and Congress had worked at disestablishing Indian governments, at disarming Indian resistance. And so having herded the Indians onto the reservations up until the 1860s, in the 1880s, it was very easy then for Congress legislatively to pass the 1887 General Allotment Act. And what that act did was say, look, we're going to turn the Indians into farmers. And so all that land we gave them, they don't need that to be farmers. We're going to divide up all those lands into 160 and 80-acre parcels, give them to heads of Indian households. And then all the lands left over will go to white homesteaders, all those Irishmen and Europeans coming over who needed land. Well, after the allotment process was over, the 144 million acres that Indians had been guaranteed under their treaties, as you said, had been reduced by 90 million acres. And I always make the point, more land was lost by Indian tribes under U.S. Indian law, under federal Indian law, that were ever lost through a treaty. Those treaties were broken. The only way Congress could appropriate those lands was to break those treaties. And a very famous case in the 1900s called Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock held, in fact, that when Congress breached a treaty in order to implement the Allotment Act and to take lands away from tribes, it was a political question. It could not be litigated. And guess what the doctrine was that supported that? The Doctrine of Discovery. Because under the Doctrine of Discovery, Congress has plenary power, which means it can do whatever it wants with Indian lands and